Hi, everybody. Welcome to our podcast. This is the very first episode of the Contact Listens podcast. This episode is risk assessment in text-based crisis conversations, and we are aiming to support people who work in crisis services and also people in the community to expand their knowledge and their ability to support people in crisis. I am Azita. I am the clinical program director here at Contact. And we have Miss Michelle. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thank you. Yes, I am Michelle Gatewood. I'm the Deputy Executive Director here at Contact Careline and excited to be able to do this today, Azita. I know we've been really excited to be able to introduce our podcast. So thanks in advance to everyone that's going to listen to us today.
Yes, thank you so much. So Michelle, do you want to kick us off? Talk about our topic?
Absolutely. I think this is one that everybody is very interested in with what we do, with the primary focus being safety. So we're going to talk about risk assessment today. We're going to cover two topics that are fairly broad, but we're going to do our best to make this as bite-sized as possible. And then also give you a couple of tips and tricks and maybe some techniques to level up those risk assessment skills that are already really strong for most of our staff, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we get excellent scores from the 988 Lifeline. External quality reviewers, we use a rubric that 988 uses to score us. The rubric has 8 sections. It goes over things like active engagement and risk assessment, which is part of why we're here. And they use that same rubric for calls and chat text. So some of what we'll talk today about is how can we use that same quality expectation and meet those in a totally different modality. Things are going to look a lot different.
Yeah, for sure. And I think because, like you said, there's so many different expectations and boxes that we're trying to check off, that it can be particularly challenging when you're translating those skills to a text-based interaction, because there just isn't as much back and forth in a text-based interaction, despite the fact that they go on for a lot longer. For example, you and I have already had enough exchanges in these first few minutes that probably would take about a half an hour, if not longer, maybe, in a text-based conversation. So we really do have to be intentional and efficient when we are trying to get those fairly thorough assessments in that particular modality. All right, so let's dive into risk assessment as a kind of function of these conversations that we're doing. And I've got a question for you, Azita. In your opinion, what are the most important things to remember when someone's doing a risk assessment?
Great question. I would say there's 3 things to remember as your foundation of risk assessment in every conversation. First of all, the assessment should feel good. It shouldn't be like it's part of the conversation. Our conversation should make our person feel supported. So asking these questions, getting the information that you need to know to determine someone's risk level should feel good to them. It should be conversational. And that's the next point. Assessment always should have a conversational flow instead of taking that rubric, taking those risk items and just going one by one. Do you have thoughts of suicide? Yes. We got to ask that one. That one's a given every time. But asking directly might not always need to be the way. You're going to be able to gain information just by listening. You'll hear some of the components, and we'll talk more about the components, but you'll hear them in the narrative. And as part of a conversational risk assessment, you might hear, oh, that was hopelessness. And you can reflect that. You can pull that out and say, I hear you feeling hopeless. I hear you feel like things are not going to get better. That's an essential risk factor. You can't know someone's level of risk unless you know how hopeless they feel.
Sure.
So the conversational flow, it should feel good. It should not feel clipboardy, should not feel robotic, no judgment there, no trying to talk someone out of it as you're assessing the risk. And the biggest one, I think, is that all 4 of the components of suicide risk, and if you're not familiar, that's the desire, intent, capability, and buffers. All of that should be in your mind all of the time, the whole conversation, so that when they pop up, you can just grab onto them, like that hopelessness one. We use a really simple model called the ladder up model, which goes through, are you having thoughts of suicide? Do you have a plan? Do you have the means to your plan? What's the time frame? And are there any buffers in your way? And so it's a really quick, like a shorthand way to get from no information to, is this person at imminent risk? Because that's the time frame part, you know?
Yeah.
But there's so much more information that's not in those. Even the ladder, though, this is a shorthand, but each rung of the ladder represents one of those 4 components. So do you have a plan? That's asking about intent, but there's so much more to intent. So yes, you can ask, you should ask for sure. But as you're doing that, listen for the other pieces. They might say, I gave a box of my things to my mom, and you might reflect that you're starting to say goodbye. And that's a measure of intent that you gained not by asking, what have you done? You can ask, absolutely. Ask, what have you done to prepare for your death? But you might not have to ask if you're listening.
I love that. You might not have to ask if you're listening. That's a really great tip for sure for our people. I love that, Azita.
Thanks. So Michelle, what would you say is different about text-based interactions? Because all of the things we just said can really apply to both modalities.
Sure. And I think your tips on that conversational flow really bring out what you can do in a text-based conversation to be able to have to avoid that checklist or asking a bunch of questions, because the more messages you send, the more time it takes for sure to be able to get through things. So I think when people are thinking about those text-based conversations, we just aren't going to be able to go into depth for each component as much as maybe we would be able to on a call. A typical crisis call, typically anywhere between 11 and 20 minutes, sometimes longer, but most of those are fairly quick. But if you were to translate the transcript of a call into a chat or a text conversation, it would probably translate to about 4 or 5 hours, really. So we can't go into as much depth when we are assessing each one of those components. But then we still need to do that and kind of hit that thorough. So what does thorough mean? And I think that means different things, frankly, for a call than versus a text. So we might not be able to hit those pieces that are nice to know because we just can't make it sound like a checklist and go through every piece. So you might not be able to know about past attempts. Maybe you just don't have the time to go into that. We may not be able to really uncover that withheld intent. So even if your spidey senses are tingling, that maybe there's more behind what they're sharing with you than might be actual, we might not be able to get in there, and we're just going to have to do the best we can with the information they do provide. We might not be able to hear the tone of their voice, right, when we're doing a chat or text conversation. So you may not even pick up on withheld intent. Mm-hmm. So if you ask somebody in a phone call, are you having thoughts of suicide? And they say, no, you would know to maybe circle back later, but you can't tell that in a text-based conversation. And then I think too, although it's great to know the history of someone's suicidal ideation, we might not be able to get into that. In a text-based conversation, we're likely really going to have to focus on what's happening for them today and trying to get a current assessment of their risk in that particular moment. I think, too, one of the things most of our staff experience is that in a text-based conversation, people idle out. So you might be right in the middle of an assessment and have to send those idle messages and maybe close that conversation. So in those moments of idle, efficiency is key. So I really think it's helpful with that first idle message. If you are waiting for an answer on some sort of assessment question, is to tie that question into that idle message. If you say, hey, Joe, are you still there? I'm going to close this out if I don't hear from you within 5 minutes, might not get Joe to re-engage. But if we say, hey, Joe, I'm going to have to close this out if I don't hear from you in another 5 minutes. And I really wanted to know if you've had a chance to go get those pills that you were mentioning. So if you tag on that assessment question to that idle message, you might make it safe for them to re-engage and you might be able to finish that assessment. So that's just a really great thing to think about when you're sending some of those messages to keep people engaged. I know that, Azita, you really are probably one of our most knowledgeable quality experts here when it comes to those. And so I wanted to ask you how crisis conversations can meet those QI expectations from your viewpoint when they're a chat and text. So how do we still hit those boxes, but without the ability to have as many back and forth messages as we would in a conversation?
Great question. And I think you touched on some of that already, which might include some of that. You can't really get in depth as much when you're not having some of that information, the tone of voice and the pauses that are natural in conversation and in speech, I should say. So the Lifeline has the expectation that the mandatory questions, which of course are you thinking of suicide and have you taken any action to harm yourself today? So the Lifeline would like those items to be asked in a text-based conversation within the first 5 to 7 messages. A lot of times.
Now, I got a question for you on that one, Azita. Yeah. Is it the 5 to 7 messages between me and the support seeker? Do the support seekers count?
No. So this is 5 to 7 messages, responses that I've made to the visitor. Great clarifying question. So a lot of times people's instinct is to, let's just get those questions out of the way so we can move on and have a conversation. But remember, the whole conversation is the assessment. And you're not required to ask those questions immediately. It can be really helpful to you as a counselor, to the way that your support seeker feels in the conversation, and to your ability to get all this information in a timely fashion and a more thorough fashion if you put those mandatory questions in context. So you start that narrative process, learning the story, exploring what's going on for them, hearing their emotions, starting to gain a sense of those 4 components. And when you have the context of the desire for suicide, you can ask at that point. A lot of times when people are feeling so hopeless, they're thinking about suicide. Are you thinking about suicide today? And you've already gained so much information. If I've sent 5 to 7 messages, what have they sent? I've gotten a lot of context that I can use to propel us forward. And that is going to be more efficient every time, because I think sometimes people think of, and the rubric lends to this also, because the rubric is obviously linear, it's on a piece of paper, but we are not going from active engagement to exploration. We're doing exploration and active engagement together. And we're not doing these 2 things and adding on risk assessment. That's all happening at the same time. So if you are keeping that in mind, you are not going to be on this deadline of, I got to get my narrative out of the way so I can move on to my assessment. I got to get my assessment out of the way so I can move on to safety planning. It's all happening together. So that is my best tip for keeping those things rolling and meeting those expectations.
Nice. Yeah.
Thanks. So we talked some about the components. That's one of my very favorite topics in all of this, in the whole work. This is one of my favorite topics. I know that you have made a really great analogy to puzzle pieces. So I wonder if you can explain your puzzle piece analogy.
Yes, I love me an analogy. Anybody that knows me knows that I love imagery and an analogy. And so this is something that I think was really helpful, and a lot of people have said is useful when you're thinking about risk assessment. So most of us, analogies are most helpful when we're learning with something that we all know. Most of us have put together a puzzle. And so risk assessment really is doing that, right? You're using different pieces to try to discover this whole picture of what's going on with this particular person. And so we can think about the mandatory questions like those corner pieces. So the first thing typically that you do when you are going through is you pull out all those pieces and you want to identify those corner pieces. Those are going to anchor your overall structure of that picture that you're building. So those two questions really are like the corner pieces in a puzzle. They're going to frame and begin the process of understanding where that person is that day. After corner pieces, Azita, what do you typically find?
Edges.
Edges, right? So then we go through and we find those edges. Those edges are that ladder up process. So those edge pieces really help us to locate those additional things that we might need to ask about, and they're going to give us a frame. They're going to kind of build that structure of these are the things that we know are already occurring, and we get a sense of the shape of that risk, the size of the risk with those edge pieces of that ladder up. And then at that point, what we're trying to do is we're trying to take those internal pieces. So once you've built that frame of your puzzle, now you're going through those internal pieces and maybe you're looking for similar colors or something seems significant. There's something interesting on a piece that you set aside. And so that's what we're doing with the rest of our assessment. So it doesn't stop at those mandatory questions and the ladder up typically. We want to fill in the rest of that puzzle so we get as much of a complete picture as we possibly can. And I think one of the things that you were talking about with that conversational flow is that open-ended questions can be a great way to fill in the rest of those pieces. We talk about close-ended questions being really, really useful in assessment. That's typically the most appropriate place for those in a conversation. But those open-ended questions can give you a lot of information, especially in a text-based conversation. So I have some examples people may consider. So if we wanted to learn more about desire, you might say something like, or type something like, what emotions are you feeling that are fueling those urges to die? That's going to help you uncover maybe hopelessness or feeling like a burden or feeling ineffective or disconnected from people. We know, especially from Joiner, one of Azita's favorite people in the field, that these are really big pieces, right? That thwarted belongingness is a big piece of what leads to people to act on their thoughts of suicide.
I would love to interject. I do love
please.
Joiner. That in Joiner's theory, the interpersonal theory of suicide, that's required. The three things that are absolutely required for a suicide death are the thwarted belongingness and the perceived burdensomeness, and together those create the element of desire. And then the other one is that acquired psychological capability. So yes, you have to know, do you feel like a burden? Do you feel like you don't belong? And according to Joiner, if you don't know that, you don't really know the risk.
Yeah. And that's so often something that we forget to ask about. And so those great open-ended questions like, what emotions are you feeling that are fueling these urges to die? Those are going to help uncover those things that, like you say, are so essential to us really knowing what that overall risk level is.
Mm-hmm.
I think intent is one of those pieces that we really highlight. So an open-ended question you might ask for intent is, when you think about dying, what does that mean for you right now? So someone might let you know that they're sitting next to their means, or maybe they've already taken action if they didn't already let you know at the beginning of the conversation. That's going to help you to get a sense of what is that overall intent level? Are we in that imminent risk situation with this particular person? Capability is one of my favorite things to explore, but I know sometimes it's not necessarily where everybody else goes. But like you said, that acquired psychological capability is so important in Joiner's theory. And so an open-ended question to uncover capability might be something like, when you think about killing yourself, how does it make you feel? If someone says they're still scared, we might be able to ask more about why and maybe uncover some buffers. If someone says they are fearless, that fearlessness about death, whoa, okay, that's a flag.
That's capability.
That's capability right there, that they have already gotten their brain to a point where they are ready to override our natural instinct to survive. That can be very, very risky. So if they are excited, they feel at peace. When I've had conversations, when someone says they feel at peace or they're excited about death, I know, ooh, okay, this is one of these people that's going to need a lot of time. I'm going to need to really focus here, get extra eyes on this conversation because they have that acquired capability. And then last, buffers. I think I find myself like these are some of the hardest to ask about because you're worried if you ask about buffers, maybe they'll say they have nobody. How often have you been in a conversation with someone where you're like, what supports do you have? And they're like, I have no one. Well, it's not often that people with a lot of social support really want to kill themselves. So to ask about buffers, you might say when your brain has turned toward those thoughts of wanting to die, what's kept you from acting on them? I like to avoid who because it's so common that people don't have anyone. So what's kept you from acting on them? You might know that they have plans for the future, which is one of those great buffers. Maybe they have a faith-based system. Maybe they have children, pets. Those are all things that can be uncovered with a great open-ended question like that. So lots of different ways that we can utilize those open-ended questions and that conversational flow and those active listening skills to complete our assessments. So excited about being able to talk about those open-ended questions. Those are hard for a lot of us to think of in the moment.
They are hard, especially when we're taught early on. If you have to have the answer to this question, you're going to have to ask a closed-ended question. There's really only a couple of times that you have to do that, which is, have you taken action to harm yourself today? You have to know that. You have to ask that. Unless they just say straight out, I just took a bunch of pills or I'm currently bleeding, then maybe you don't need to ask that question. But I wanted to add something about ambivalence.
Yeah.
We're talking about how you can explore buffers and how you can explore those other components. And I wanted to talk about how they can exist at the same time. You know, you might be driving to the bridge and looking at the water and rehearsing that suicide attempt, but also you have that really strong fear of death. You have a buffer and you have high intent. That can happen at the same time. And if you're asking yes or no questions, you're not going to figure that out. There's no way for you to understand that if you're not sensitive and listening to the bigger picture. So when we talk about ambivalence all the time, when we're trying to decide, is this an imminent risk situation? Is there any ambivalence? Ambivalence is very important, but it's not going to override everything. So when you're putting your puzzle together, there are going to be those murky pieces that are kind of to the side. You got to figure them out, but they're there and they're very important for the full picture.
Yeah. And I think what you've spoken to too, and maybe those open-ended questions lead to it, is that those really are like human things. Those are things that take that emotional maturity, that intellect, that it's hard for a robot to come up with some of those things. And so I think that kind of naturally leads us into the second thing we wanted to talk about, which is how to level up our risk assessment skills. And so, Azita, I want to ask you this question. If you were to reach out for crisis support, would you want to talk to a robot or someone that sounds like a robot?
Absolutely not. I would not. Goodness, it does not feel good to talk to a chatbot. It never does. I've never talked to a chat agent on a website and been like, yes, I feel better. I got my support. Never. So when I'm talking to a person who gives me the exact same feeling of, are you even a human being in the room with me right now? That does not feel good. It's frustrating. You feel alone, even though you're talking with someone. So there are a lot of conversations where counselors feel that they need to be professional. They need to sound professional. And so they want to write really nice messages that are, well articulated. They cover the whole range of reflecting everything that the person just said. Maybe they want consistency, but it comes across not human. It comes across so stiff and so scripted, especially if we're using canned messages. And canned messages, it's a hot topic, I'd say. People really like their canned messages because I think it comes with a sense of safety. Like, I'm on the spot, my mind goes blank. It happens to me all the time. It happened to me right before we started filming this. I don't know anything. So sure, having canned responses in that case would give me stuff to say, and it would be probably in the right order. But if I came out and just started reading to you things that I had already written, you're probably going to be able to tell that. Mm-hmm. And imagine you reach out multiple times and you get the same responses multiple times. What is that going to feel like to you? That's going to feel like maybe this isn't a person. And it's going to feel like I don't matter enough for you to listen to what I'm saying and write me a real response. That sucks.
Yeah.
And so the question that a lot of people have is, how do you sound like a human when you're texting? And a couple of tips: say it out loud. 100%. Say it out loud and then type it. Type it out and read it out loud. Does this sound like something you would actually say? Because we're people. As crisis counselors, we're people showing up to support another person. It's a human connection, and it has to feel that way. So think about yourself talking to a friend, or in person, you're talking with a person in crisis who's sitting right beside you. What are you going to say to them? How are you going to say it so that it's natural and you're not reading from a script? Because they can tell. They can tell that.
Sure. I will say, like, instead of you, I say, yeah, like, how are you doing? I will put YA in there. Or I've moved to the South in 2018. I don't have an accent, but I lost my G's. So if I'm saying, how are you feeling? I will say feeling instead of feeling. I will type it with just the IN. And because it's authentic with me, I think it lands well. So if it's not you, don't try to overdo it and make it sound like somebody else, but type it like you would say it. I think it's okay. People want a human. They don't want a perfect robot. They want a human, and a human isn't necessarily going to be perfect or super polished.
Right. And like you said, you say yeah, you say apostrophe and apostrophe. I will use the ... I will
love an ellipse. Yeah.
Love it. Love that. If my person says LOL as a punctuation mark, I'm going to do that sometimes too. I'm matching their tone. One of the items on the rubric is matching their tone and pace. That's part of it. That's part of the thing. If you're going to say LOL, I'm going to say LOL too. If you're giving me smileys, I'm going to give you smileys. If you swear a little bit, I'm going to swear a little bit too maybe. And that's okay. That's fine. Because you're matching them. You're meeting them where they are. That feels good.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know how many times I've had conversations with people or read conversations of others where somebody has flat out told the crisis counselor, drop your training. You sound like, is that what they told you to say? I want you to talk like a real human to me. Yeah. Can you just talk to me like a human? I don't know how many times I've seen people ask that. And so I think they deserve that though, right? They deserve us bringing our whole authentic selves into those conversations. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we have AI now who could do that if that's what we wanted, but we don't. We want real people and real connection. And you can't have that with canned responses or with thinking so hard about saying just the right thing that it doesn't sound like a person. In the moment, that's the thing. It's got to feel like you, and it's got to feel like you're in the moment, presently communicating with this person. They have to feel that too.
Yeah, for sure. I love that.
Yeah. Okay, so I know one of the tools that you enjoy a lot is the scaling question. Can you talk about that?
I will. So I think that this is something that gets a bad rap because, like you said, nobody wants to talk to a robot, right? So a lot of different centers that do crisis work approach scaling questions differently. And I think here at Contact, it's not something I see used a lot. And I'm not saying it's something that has to happen in every conversation, but it can be actually a really beneficial tool, and it can still sound authentically human. So there's kind of two different ways that you might use scaling or bracketing / laddering, however people want to call it. But using a 1 to 5 scale can really actually be super helpful when you're talking to somebody to help them to quantify either their desire or their intent. And I want to preface this that if you ever did ask someone a scaling question, you would be combining that with a tentifier, something specific from their conversation. My favorite partners of normalization and validation. So those, I think, are things that always have to happen, but it really is helpful for desire, for essence. It's saying something like, I get that you are feeling so hopeless and you said that you want to die. And to help us kind of get a baseline or a starting point here, I'm really curious on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being the weakest they've ever been and 5 being the strongest they've ever been, where are you at right now? I think that sounds human. I think that sounds conversational, and that can help you to get a score. Then once you get that score, you could ask it again at the end when we do that check-in for suicidal strength. So how's that 3? And be ready, because it's okay if it's still a 3. You should have a response. It's okay if it goes up to a 5. That's okay too. Let's talk about why that happened. Maybe it's down to a 1. Ideally, that's what happens, right? But you never know. But it's a great way to compare and to ask and to do that check-in at the end. And I think something that people can utilize them for is to uncover those drivers and those buffers for suicide. So if someone tells me, say I decide I want to ask 1 to 5 scale for intent to die. So, in the next 24 hours, I'm really curious. Let's put a number on this. 1 being there's no way you'd kill yourself. 5 being you are definitely killing yourself when we get off the phone today. Where would you put yourself? If they rated themselves at a 4, you might ask, what would make that a 5? That's going to help you uncover those drivers, those things that are fueling those thoughts and urges. If you ask them, what would bring it down to a 2? That's going to help you uncover buffers. So maybe you asked them if they have buffers and they said they have none, but then you say, what would bring it down to a 2? And they mention, I wouldn't be so worried about where I'm going to live next month. I wouldn't feel so powerless in my romantic relationship. Those can help you with the planning phases in that next phase. So those scaling questions can take some time and you may want to practice them, but it's absolutely okay to use the scaling question. I recommend 1 to 5 over 1 to 10. The shorter the scale, the better data you kind of get from it. But it's really, really helpful to be able to use that. And it's a tool you can use and play around with it. See how it feels for you. See if you can find a way to make it natural. That's the number one pieces that it would still sound authentically human.
Would you use that?
Oh, go ahead.
Would you use that type of question many times? Would that be your style for the whole?
Wouldn't. No, I think you have to be intentional and efficient. So if I were going to want to compare the beginning and the end of a conversation, I would probably only ask to scale one thing or the other. So I would probably only scale desire and then ask that second scaling question at the end. I think it's overused to scale desire and scale intent and scale how sad you are and then do all those. Then it feels like a checklist and it feels like you're making it kind of cold and impersonal. So you don't want to use all the tips and tricks and tools that you can in every conversation, but there may be conversations where it's appropriate to get a scale and then maybe ask what would make it go up, but not down, because you already have those buffers. So it really is something that you can tailor to each conversation to really make it useful, not necessarily something that you need to check off. But that's a great question for sure to ask about those.
I think that's a really interesting thing you bring up, that you're not going to use every tool in every conversation and that every conversation needs to be tailored. So when you have all of these tools, you've got them on your tool belt. When you're present in the moment and you're not in a mindset of, I'm following a formula, I'm following a script, I'm using canned responses. That frees you up to be able to look at the conversation and say, what tool do I need to help this person, to support and understand this person in front of me? I'm not here to just show up and do the job I do every single day. I'm here every 45 minutes, every hour and a half. I'm connecting with a brand new person, and they deserve a tailored assessment, a tailored intervention.
Sure. You can put way too many toppings on a pizza, and you can use way too many tools and tricks in a crisis conversation. We don't need to throw everything at them. We really do need to be thoughtful about what it is we're bringing out and use our intuition. I think that's something that we have all this training and all these things, but we forget that like the other piece of wanting to talk to a human is we can get some inkling of subtext, and we can kind of know, this is not the person I want to ask scaling questions to, but maybe there is somebody that would be useful to answer those too. So I think those are things that are really important to think about. And I agree. We're curating an experience for this person. We are providing a service for sure. And then the second type of kind of scaling is called bracketing, or sometimes laddered questioning. And so I think a lot of times we struggle, and ideally, I think most often we would use this with like a pills type situation if someone has taken pills. So instead of asking how many pills have you taken, which may get us a response, a lot of times people say, I don't know, or maybe they're worried to say how many pills they've taken because they're worried about the outcome. And so it might lead to minimization or them withholding the amount altogether. And then we don't get a whole picture of that. So what you can do, and this is based in like motivational interviewing and then like emergency and poison center best practice assessments, is you start with 2 realistic moderate estimates, and then the third one is like a way higher number. So if I were to ask somebody how many pills they've taken, instead of saying how many pills have you taken, I might say something like, so did you take like 2 or 10 or 50? So that third one is always a much, much higher number, so that if they have taken a bunch of them, they are more likely to tell you. And they might not know. They may have said, I took half the bottle, or I've taken 2 handfuls. But if that third number is really kind of high and seems outrageous, it actually increases the chances that they're going to disclose that actual amount. And that particular type of scaling question can also come in handy for non-suicidal self-injury or self-harm assessments, like with cutting or something like that. If you're trying to get a sense of what those episodes are like, it's, when you cut yourself, is it like 2 or 8 or 50? That's going to help you get a really good sense of those too. So yeah, those are 2 really great ways that you can use scaling questions in a crisis conversation risk assessment.
Yeah, I can just hearing you say that, I can think to several conversations that needed supervisor consult, and part of the question was, I'm not sure how many they took. They wouldn't say how many they took, and that could be a super helpful way because we encounter that all the time.
Yeah, for sure. People typically don't call us wanting law enforcement to come to their door. And answering that question honestly, there's a lot of I understand, I think you do, most of our crisis counselors listening do understand why someone may not feel comfortable providing that information, but that bracketing or that kind of laddering, that does help them to feel it more normalizes the questions that we're asking.
Right. Wow. We have talked about so many things, and I could talk about it for another 5 years. It's such a good. Yes, next episode, the 4-year episode. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening to our very first Contact Listens podcast. We hope so much that you took some nuggets away and you feel more confident in risk assessment and curious to put some of these tools to work. So I want to say thank you so much for helping us build a world where everyone has someone who truly listens. We did it!